From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We will not create the energy and excitement we need to defeat Donald Trump if that candidate pursued, advocated for, and enacted racist policies like stop and frisk, which cause communities of color in his city to live in fear.
With the Nevada caucuses less than a week away, Democratic presidential candidates are accusing billionaire Michael Bloomberg of buying his way into the election and spreading his wealth to keep critics silent. The New York Times says some are calling Bloomberg a wallet too big to offend. We'll speak with a lawyer who, when she worked for the Bloomberg-funded Center for American Progress, says she was told to remove or revise a chapter on anti-Muslim bias and surveillance of Muslim communities in New York that mentioned Bloomberg by name 8 times. Then to Yemen, where 31 people were killed in U.S.-backed Saudi airstrikes, including women and children. The United Nations called the attack shocking.
So we are here. This is one of the cars that were targeted by the Saudi American Air Force last night. And they also targeted villages in Malaha area and residential areas, causing tens of martyrs and injuries. And this is a civilian's car.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The number of coronavirus infections continues to mount, with 71,000 confirmed cases globally and nearly 1,800 deaths, all but 5 of the deaths in mainland China. However, Chinese officials said Sunday marked the 3rd straight day when there was a drop in new cases. A Chinese man who is visiting France has died from the disease, marking the first fatality in Europe and outside Asia. Over 300 Americans were repatriated after being evacuated from the Diamond Princess cruise ship that has been docked at a port in Yokohama, Japan, for 2 weeks. 14 of the passengers that are being sent to the United States are infected with coronavirus. The passengers, who've now landed in Texas and California, will be quarantined on bases in the United States for 2 weeks. Over 450 passengers on the cruise ship contracted coronavirus. Around 3,600 people were quarantined on Diamond Princess. Meanwhile, Chinese state media released a speech by President Xi Jinping indicating he was aware of the seriousness of the outbreak weeks before alerting the Chinese public. Over 1,100 former Justice Department officials are calling for Attorney General William Barr to step down after he intervened to reduce the Justice Department's sentencing recommendation for President Trump's longtime friend, former campaign advisor Roger Stone. In an open letter published Sunday, the former officials write, quote, "Governments that use the enormous power of law enforcement to punish their enemies and reward their allies are not constitutional republics. They are autocracies," they wrote. Barr intervened in the case after Trump called Stone's sentence of 7 to 9 years a miscarriage of justice. 4 federal prosecutors withdrew from the case. 1 resigned from his job completely over Barr's actions. On Friday, Trump claimed he has the power to intervene in criminal cases. In response to Barr's statement last week that Trump has never asked him to do anything in a criminal case, Trump tweeted, quote, "This doesn't mean I do not have, as president, the legal right to do so. I do, but I have so far chosen not to," Trump tweeted. A group of 9 Democratic senators, including presidential candidates Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, also called for Barr's resignation in an open letter Friday. Meanwhile, Attorney General Barr has reportedly assigned an outside prosecutor to review the criminal case against Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. Flynn pleaded guilty in 2017 to lying to federal investigators about conversations he had with Russia's ambassador to the United States. In Nevada, early voters have been lining up at the polling stations ahead of next Saturday's caucuses. The Nevada Democratic Party reported some 18,000 people took part in early voting Saturday, the first of 4 days of early voting. Some election volunteers have expressed concern they haven't received sufficient training or information about the Google Forms that will be used to report results of the caucuses. Meanwhile, the Iowa Democratic Party says it started a partial recanvass of Iowa's caucus results that was requested by the Sanders and Buttigieg campaigns. Candidates are campaigning in Nevada and across states set to vote on Super Tuesday, March 3rd. On Sunday, Senator Bernie Sanders held a rally in Denver, Colorado, where he addressed an estimated 11,000 people.
And we are going to end a corrupt political system in which billionaires buy elections. Democracy, to me, means one person, one vote. Not Bloomberg or anybody else spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to buy an election.
Coloradans will vote on Super Tuesday, as will residents of Alabama, Arkansas, California, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. In more news about the Democratic candidates, Senator Amy Klobuchar has come under fire after she did not know the name of the president of Mexico during an interview on Telemundo and was unable to speak about any of his policies. The Mexican president is Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Billionaire Tom Steyer also couldn't name him. And in other news about the 2020 elections, Facebook is coming under scrutiny for allowing certain kinds of political ads, which allows billionaire and former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg to post so-called branded content for his campaign via the social media accounts of popular influencers. Bloomberg is paying to have the accounts post memes and videos of Bloomberg to raise his profile among younger voters. Meanwhile, Mike Bloomberg continues to come under renewed scrutiny for his past comments and positions, including promoting stop and frisk and his support for redlining. On Saturday, the Washington Post reported multiple lawsuits have been filed over the years alleging women were discriminated against at Bloomberg's company, including one case filed by a former employee who blamed Bloomberg for creating a culture of sexual harassment and degradation. Bloomberg and his organizations have been defendants in almost 40 sexual harassment and discrimination lawsuits. We'll have more on this and the candidacy of Mike Bloomberg after headlines. LGBTQ activists of color disrupted a speech by Pete Buttigieg Friday at San Francisco's National LGBTQ Center for the Arts. A Buttigieg supporter responded by calling the protesters homophobes, to which protesters responded, quote, "We're all gay." The two protesters were taken out of the event after they were booed by attendees of the fundraiser. Outside the fundraiser, activists from the group Queers Against Pete and other groups gathered to call out Buttigieg's ties to Wall Street and its policies that they say do not reflect the progressive views of many queer-identifying people and people of color. These include his lack of support for Medicare for all, free college, and his track record on race issues during his time as mayor of South Bend, Indiana. In Yemen, 31 people were killed in U.S.-backed Saudi airstrikes over the weekend, including women and children. The strikes in the northern Al-Jaf province came just hours after the Houthis said they had shot down a Saudi fighter jet in the same area. On Sunday, the United Nations said the Houthis and the U.S.-backed Saudi UAE coalition had agreed to a major prisoner swap, the first of its kind in the long-running war. More than 100,000 have died and far more have been displaced since the conflict began in 2015. In Syria, fighting's intensifying between government forces and opposition groups, displacing more civilians who've had to flee toward the northern border. This is a displaced civilian speaking from a refugee camp.
We fled 5 days ago from the western province of Anjara. We escaped the airstrikes and the shelling. The journey was very difficult. It was cold. We couldn't find a car. We kept walking until we found a car to take us here. We're now in a camp near Afrin. staying in a tent just to get by. The past 3 days have been cold on the road and on the streets.
800,000 people have been displaced since December, and the UN is warning of a humanitarian disaster. Syrian government officials said they seized most of the rebel-held Aleppo province Sunday amidst their ongoing offensive. Turkish and Russian officials are holding talks in Moscow today. In Afghanistan, an airstrike killed at least 8 civilians, including a child, in the eastern province of Nangarhar, according to local reports. The latest civilian deaths came as the U.S. declared a 7-day partial truce with the Taliban, and President Trump said there's a good chance of reaching an agreement with the Taliban to reduce the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. At the Munich Security Conference this weekend, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani said a peace deal could come within days. In Mexico City, Valentine's Day protests called out the Mexican government and media for its inaction and, in some cases, complicity in the high rates of femicide. The Friday protests were sparked by the publication of graphic images of the murdered 25-year-old woman Ingrid Escamilla's mutilated body in a tabloid accompanied by the headline, "It was Cupid's fault." Escamilla was murdered by her boyfriend. This is Lilia Florencio Guerrero, whose daughter, Diana Velázquez Florencio, was raped and killed in 2017.
It fills us with rage and anger how President López Obrador makes his statements about material things and how an airplane raffle is more important to him than the 10 women who are murdered every day in this country. So yes, it fills us with rage and anger, and that's why we're here, because they're murdering us, and this government and the last one are not interested in us.
The Trump administration began deploying specially trained tactical customs and border protection units over the weekend to so-called sanctuary cities across the country in the latest attempt to crack down on cities that refuse to cooperate with the Trump administration's immigration policies. The CBP SWAT teams will reportedly help ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, carry out raids against suspected undocumented people. They're being relocated from the southern border to cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and New Orleans in an ongoing deployment that will last through May. In more immigration news, a new report by The Washington Post says confidential notes taken in mandatory therapy sessions for immigrant minors are passed to ICE, which can then use those notes against the children and teens in court. A memo from the Trump administration about the U.S. targeted assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani last month does not refer to an imminent threat, which was President Trump's justification for assassinating him. House Foreign Affairs Chair Eliot Engel said the report, quote, shows that the justification the president offered to the American people was false, plain and simple, unquote. The memo was released the day after the Senate voted to pass a resolution limiting Trump's authority to attack Iran without congressional approval. In New York, attorney Michael Avenatti was found guilty Friday of wire fraud and extorting Nike for up to $25 million. Prosecutors say Avenatti threatened to reveal damaging information on improper payments made by Nike to student-athletes unless they either paid him off or retained his services. Avenatti is best known as Stormy Daniels' former lawyer during her hush money case against President Trump. Avenatti faces a maximum prison sentence of 42 years, will be sentenced in June. He's also facing charges in Los Angeles of defrauding clients and a federal case in New York in which he's accused of stealing money owed to Stormy Daniels from a book publisher. A federal appeals court struck down Trump's attempt to impose Medicaid work requirements Friday, saying Health Secretary Alex Azar's approval of the program in Arkansas was, quote, arbitrary and capricious. The measure allowed Arkansas to demand Medicaid recipients work in order to receive their health benefits. And the case against activists who were arrested last April while they were staging a weeks-long protest at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., ended in a mistrial Friday after a hung jury. The 4 activists were staying at the embassy at the behest of the Venezuelan government to prevent its takeover by U.S.-backed supporters of the opposition leader Juan Guaidó. This is Margaret Flowers, one of the embassy protectors after the mistrial was declared.
We're very happy with this verdict. Of course, we would have been happier with an acquittal, but for today, we remain innocent as we are, and we appreciate this tremendous amount of support that we've received from people here coming to the trial, as well as people around the world sending us messages of solidarity. La lucha continúa.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. With the Nevada caucuses less than a week away, many Democratic candidates are courting voters and increasingly targeting their attacks on billionaire Michael Bloomberg, who they're accusing of buying his way into the election. This is leading Democratic presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders speaking Sunday at a rally in Carson City, Nevada.
We will not create the energy and excitement we need to defeat Donald Trump if that candidate pursued, advocated for, and enacted racist policies like stop and frisk, which cause communities of color in his city to live in fear.
In the lead-up to Super Tuesday on March 3rd, when voters in 14 states go to the polls, Bloomberg has spent an unprecedented $417 million of his own $60 billion fortune on advertising. He's also paid meme influencers to share sponsored content on Instagram, hired thousands of on-the-ground political operatives to work in more than 125 offices around the country. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports multiple lawsuits have been filed over the years alleging that women were discriminated against at Bloomberg's business information company, including one case filed by a former worker who blamed Bloomberg for creating a culture of sexual harassment and degradation. Bloomberg and his organizations have been defendants in almost 40 sexual harassment and discrimination lawsuits. But a major investigation in Sunday's New York Times, headlined "In Bloomberg, Liberals See a Wallet Too Big to Offend," lays out how Bloomberg established a foundation to silence potential critics during his presidential bid by making major donations to progressive causes and advocacy groups around the country. The Times estimates Bloomberg has spent at least $10 billion on charitable pursuits related to his political ambitions. In 2019 alone, the year he declared his presidential candidacy, the New York Times reports Bloomberg's charitable giving soared to $3.3 billion, more than in the previous 5 years combined. Well, for more, we're joined in Philadelphia by Blake Zeff, a journalist and documentary filmmaker who's covered New York politics and Michael Bloomberg's 3 terms as mayor. Blake Zeff, welcome to Democracy Now! Last week you had a fascinating Twitter thread about what Bloomberg's strategy is. And it's not just the unprecedented, massive amount of money that he is spending, but it's also how he spends that money. And this has been going on for many years. Can you lay out Bloomberg's strategy?
Absolutely. I think there's this kind of idea that he's spending so much money on ads, and that enables him to get his message out a little bit more than other candidates, and that's kind of where the big advantage lies. And yes, he's doing that, but there is a lot more to it than that. You talked a little bit about how much he's spent in recent years supporting causes and leaders and things like that. But let's talk about that a bit more. I think a lot of people might be surprised to see how many endorsements Michael Bloomberg has been racking up in his presidential campaign as kind of a former local mayor. He's got Congress members throughout the country. He's got mayors throughout the country. Well, he spent about $110 million last cycle alone in 2018 supporting House candidates, 24 of whom won. You've got 24 members of Congress getting $110 million. That's, some of them are getting $2 million, some of them are getting $4 million. And then you have that person come to you a year later and say, boy, I'd really love it if you could help me out. It's hard for them to say no, right? Then you've got mayors. You might be surprised to see how many mayors he's getting throughout the country. Well, he's got a philanthropy that gives out grants for urban programs. If your city is struggling and you want to get some sort of big grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies, that puts you in a tough spot. Then he's got nonprofits and charities. When Bloomberg ran for mayor, in New York City, he tried to get himself a third term, which was, at that time, not really allowed in New York because the voters had a term limits referendum. Well, Bloomberg engineered a backroom deal, and amazingly, a lot of the big nonprofits in the city supported him on that. Why? We later found out that he'd given them millions of dollars. So that money goes to lots of different places beyond just merely TV commercials.
And explain what you mean. For example, for people outside of New York City, for people to understand, I mean, it was Mayor Mike Bloomberg himself who also supported term limits. Explain what the policy was in the city and how he ended up flipping it and going for a third term with, as you said, these good government groups who were absolutely opposed to a third term. It's not that he thought he could get them to say, we support this, but his strategy of neutralizing critics using money.
Right. So 2 points. On term limits in particular, this was fascinating. The voters of New York had said, we don't want our mayors to have more than 2 terms or be able to even run for it. There was a voter referendum. This was on the books. Bloomberg decides towards the very end of his second term that he'd like to be mayor again. They come up with a rationale, which is that, the city's been recovering from hard times. This was right around the time of, the Great Recession, if you will, kind of the housing crash, 2009. And they come up with this rationale that we need his economic expertise so badly that he needs to run again. Of course, later it's revealed by some of his allies, years later, that this was just an excuse to come up with some way for him to stay in office because he really wanted to do the job. So what does Bloomberg do? It's not just that he gave money to groups to kind of not make a big fuss, although he did. He also was able to use his status as a billionaire to go to the billionaire publishers of the big newspapers in New York City. So you got the Daily News, you got the New York Post, you've got the New York Times, all run by these very wealthy families. They rarely agree on anything, these newspapers, these editorial pages in particular. But they all met with Bloomberg, decided to sign on to this plan for him to go for a third term, all put out editorials kind of in unison, in lockstep, saying this is a great idea for the city. And that was a big part of that, developing and sort of laying the groundwork for the support for Bloomberg to do that. To your other point about him getting typical critics or potential critics to be silent on stuff, he changes his Republican voter registration to being an independent in the middle of his mayoralty. And you would think at that point, okay, the state Republican Party is now free to attack him for the rest of his term because he's not a Republican anymore. But they never did. And people were curious, why is that? Well, then we learned that he gave a record $1 million to the Republican State Senate Fund to kind of, not say too much. So the money works in all these different ways.
We're going to break and then come back to our conversation. We're talking to Blake Zeff, journalist, documentary filmmaker, covered New York politics and Michael Bloomberg's terms as mayor. His forthcoming film is Lone Wolves, investigating the origins and effects of the student debt crisis in America. We'll be back with him and more in a moment.
A spider's touch, a cold finger beckons you to enter his web of sin, but don't go in. Golden words he will pour in your ear, but his lies can't disguise what you feel. For a golden girl knows when he's kissed her, it's the kiss of death from Mr. Goldfinger. Pretty girl, beware of this heart of gold. This heart is cold.
Goldfinger by Shirley Bassey. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at how billionaire Democratic presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg wields the power of his money in different ways. There was a major front-page story in Sunday's New York Times headlined, "In Bloomberg, Liberals See a Wallet Too Big to Offend." The piece lays out how Bloomberg has kept potential critics quiet by making major major donations to progressive causes and advocacy groups around the country. The Times reports, quote, that chilling effect was apparent in 2015 to researchers at the Center for American Progress, a liberal policy group, when they turned in a report on anti-Muslim bias in the United States. Their draft included a chapter of more than 4,000 words about New York City police surveillance of Muslim communities. Mr. Bloomberg was mentioned by name 8 times in the chapter, which was reviewed by the Times. When the report was published a few weeks later, the chapter was gone. So was any mention of Mr. Bloomberg's name. Well, for more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Yasmeen Taeb, one of the authors of the report. She says they were told to make major changes to the chapter or remove it. Other officials told the New York Times they revised the report to make it focus on right-wing groups targeting Muslims. When the report came out, Bloomberg had already given the Center for American Progress 3 grants worth nearly $1.5 million and contributed $400,000 more in 2017. Yasmeen Taeb no longer works at the Center for American Progress, but she is now a member of the Democratic National Committee. And still with us in Philadelphia, journalist Blake Zeff, who covered New York politics and Mayor Bloomberg's 3 terms. Thank you so much both for joining us. Yasmeen Taeb, tell us what took place when you worked for the Center for American Progress. Tell us about this report.
Sure. So as you likely know, Amy, Fearing 2.0, which was released actually exactly 5 years ago today, and I was on your show 5 years ago talking about the findings. It was a follow-up to Center for American Progress's blockbuster Fearing first report, which was released in 2011. And the report was simply a follow-up to, discuss the tightly knit network of anti-Muslim activists, politicians, organizations, and funders who are, fanning anti-Muslim sentiment. And the report additionally was to chronicle and detail anti-Muslim policies that were being promoted. And in particular, this is racial and religious profiling by law enforcement across the country.
And so talk about your chapter on surveillance of the Muslim community during the Bloomberg administration by the NYPD police and bias against the Muslim community. What did you say there, and what happened to this chapter? Why didn't we see it?
So there was a very, detailed chapter about the NYPD's demographics unit. So the demographics unit was established shortly after 9/11, and it was operating for more than 10 years or so. And the demographics unit was tasked with mapping the Muslim community in New York City, and that entailed, following, monitoring, surveilling Muslims of where they prayed, shopped, and ate. The program was later ruled unconstitutional. Mayor Bloomberg and his administration throughout the entire period defended this program. This program, as you likely know, resulted actually in 0 terror leads. This program was unconstitutional. It had a chilling effect on the local Muslim community there. And my colleagues and I, the co-authors, which included Ken Good, Ken Sofer, and Matt Duss and I, we simply detailed exactly what happened and purpose and impact of this discriminatory program. And, while we were in the final stages of this report being released, and this is literally within a week of the program, the project being launched, we had to get approval from senior officials at the Center for American Progress, and that's when the chapter was flagged by a member of the executive committee who actually previously had worked for Mayor Bloomberg, and he said that there would be a strong reaction by Bloomberg World if this report was released as it was. And so, we went back and forth multiple times with the executive committee defending, the importance of the inclusion of this chapter. And unfortunately, the executive committee ultimately decided to remove it because, in my view and my colleagues' views, because of how it was going to be perceived by Mayor Bloomberg.
And so talk about the significance of this. And I want to bring Blake Zeff in here to talk about the pattern here that you see. That was a report by the Center for American Progress. We didn't see that particular chapter. In the New York Times, the Center for American Progress responds and says they that they had focused on that they disputed the account, arguing there had been substantive reasons to revise or remove a section on police surveillance. Why did you, Yasmin Tayeb, decide to remove it entirely rather than revise it?
So, because it was so clear that they wanted us to produce an inaccurate portrayal of the demographics unit's egregious actions. We absolutely did not want to whitewash what the NYPD did. And I mean, again, this is a program that was later ruled unconstitutional. This is a program that infringed on the First Amendment rights of Muslims in the local community. This is a program that, again, was disbanded by Mayor de Blasio because it was a complete failure. Not only was it unconstitutional, complete failure, and led to zero terror, leads. For me, it was incredibly frustrating. It was incredibly disconcerting because of the amount of work that we had put into this report and project. This was an ongoing report that we had worked for more than a year, and within days of launching the project and the interactive, being told by senior officials, unfortunately, at the Center for American Progress to remove it.
Blake Zeff, the issue of the pattern and practice here.
Yeah, look, if you see that New York Times article that you were referring to, Amy, there's a really interesting quote in there where former DNC chair Terry McAuliffe, who was really one of the most prodigious fundraisers for the Democratic Party over the last couple of decades, first for the Clintons, then for the Democratic Party, and then later for his own races. He basically says that Michael Bloomberg was one of, if not the most important fundraisers for the Democratic Party during that time. And as a result of that, I mean, he really has been, Bloomberg, a prodigious, towering figure in Democratic circles because of his pocketbook and the fact that he has been bankrolling a lot of these groups, a lot of these causes. And as a result, that enables him to wield a tremendous amount of influence.
I wanted to go to the beginning of this blockbuster New York Times piece. Starts on the front page, goes to 2 other pages. This is the opening paragraphs. The New York Times writes, in the fall of 2018, Emily's List had a dilemma. With congressional elections approaching and the Supreme Court confirmation battle over Judge Brett Kavanaugh underway, the Democratic Women's Group was hosting a major fundraising luncheon in New York. Among the scheduled headline speakers was Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor, who had donated nearly $6 million to Emily's List over the years. Days before the event, Bloomberg made blunt comments in an interview with the New York Times, expressing skepticism about the Me Too movement and questioning sexual misconduct allegations against Charlie Rose, the disgraced news anchor. Senior Emily's List officials seriously debated withdrawing Bloomberg's invitation, according to 3 people familiar with the deliberations who spoke on the condition of anonymity. In the end, the group concluded it could not risk alienating Mr. Bloomberg, and when he addressed the luncheon on September 24th before an audience dotted with women clad in black to show solidarity with Christine Blasey Ford, the woman who accused Judge Kavanaugh of sexual assault, Mr. Bloomberg demonstrated why. He said, I will be putting more money into supporting women candidates this cycle than any individual ever has before, he declared. It was not an idle pledge. Bloomberg spent more than $100 million helping Democrats take control of the House of Representatives in the midterm elections. Of the 21 newly elected lawmakers he supported with his personal super PAC, all but 6 were women. Blake Zeff.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of this larger pattern and trend that we've been talking about. Also in the story, just to come back to this Terry McAuliffe quote that I just mentioned, what's interesting about that is when Bloomberg first ran in 2001 and McAuliffe was the head of the DNC, He railed against anyone who had been part of the Democratic Party but was helping Bloomberg, whether that was consultants, endorsers, and groups and whatnot. And then it shows that 20 years later, McAuliffe's talking about him almost with a sparkle in his eyes about what a great donor he's been and how important he's been and how he helped fund some gun control work that he had done. And this is something that you see, as you just mentioned with Emily's list, you see with McAuliffe, you see with all these groups who are faced these big dilemmas, just like the mayors I was mentioning before, just like the members of Congress that I was mentioning before, the charities, the nonprofits, all these groups that we've just been talking about all face the same dilemma where they're either underfunded or they need money for a good cause. Bloomberg comes in and offers it to them, but then as a result, they're put in this position where it's very, very difficult to criticize him. In many cases, they're being told that they need to support him. That's a really, really difficult and frankly, unprecedented situation in American democracy.
Several prominent African-American lawmakers have endorsed Bloomberg in recent weeks. This is New York Democratic Congressmember Gregory Meeks on MSNBC.
Look, I'm from New York. Michael Bloomberg ran 3 times. I didn't support him 3 times, primarily because of stop and frisk. It was a bad policy. At the same time, I also understand that Michael Bloomberg wanted to get guns out of the community so that innocent people did not get killed. African-American voters are always, they're very sophisticated voters. You know, they vote their interests. They know that their interest is making sure that Donald Trump is defeated. That's absolutely their interest. And so they're going to move in the direction that they think who is the best person to defeat Donald Trump, and then who's also going to talk about their agenda.
Now, Mayor Bloomberg has also formed Mike for Black America. Meanwhile, New York Times columnist Charles Blow wrote a new opinion piece, quote, "Let me plant the stake now. No black person or Hispanic person or ally of people of color should ever even consider voting for Michael Bloomberg in the primary. His expansion of the notoriously racist stop-and-frisk program in New York, which swept up millions of innocent New Yorkers, primarily young black and Hispanic men, is a complete and non-negotiable deal killer." Blake Zeff, what has just happened in these last few weeks?
Yeah, there's been a bit of a rewriting of the stop and frisk legacy by Michael Bloomberg and some of his supporters. I mean, what we've seen Bloomberg do lately is say, look, I inherited this policy. I apologized for its excesses, and I reduced it 95%. In fact, let's go through each one of those claims one by one. Yes, the policy did exist initially under Republican Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and we all know who that is. But a new mayor can come in and decide whether they want to continue that or not. Not only did Bloomberg continue it, but he expanded it to record levels. When he first came in, the number of stops per year was under 100,000. It then rose steadily under Bloomberg until 2011, when it reached its apex, and almost 700,000 stops were made that year. So I say he inherited it, factually is true, but he also greatly, greatly expanded it. In terms of reducing it 95%, well, as I just mentioned, it just kept expanding until eventually in 2013, it does get rolled back considerably, but that's the year that a federal judge rules the policy unconstitutional. And Bloomberg was the subject of a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit. And so that clearly had something to do with that. And in terms of the apology, this is really egregious because there were so many groups that were up in arms about this policy for many, many years. And Bloomberg and his defenders remained defiant, constantly saying that we need this in order for crime to go down, and sort of suggesting that if you opposed it, that you were basically opening the doors to the bad old days of crime, terrible crime coming back. Well, after the policy was really, really curtailed, after Bloomberg left, New York continued to see these reductions in crime, and he was really proven wrong on that. Again, did not apologize. Years go by. The Daily News, one of his big editorial supporters in general and also on stop and frisk, issued a big apology a couple of years after Bloomberg left, saying we were wrong on stop and frisk. Bloomberg did not do that. Then let's go to 2019. January 2019, he's at a big event for the U.S. Naval Academy. He continues to defend the policy. Finally, in November of 2019, he talks to an audience in Brooklyn and says, it was a black audience, and he says, I'm sorry, I was actually wrong about that. 7 days later, he declares his candidacy for president of the United States.
And, of course, he had said a year before, if he did run for president on the Democratic ticket, he would have to do a long apology tour. Yasmin Tayeb, I wanted to go back to you. You're no longer with the Center for American Progress, but you are on the Democratic National Committee. You recently received a phone call from Mike Bloomberg. Can you tell us what that was about?
Sure. So this was at the end of December of 2019. This was, I think, shortly after he launched his presidential campaign. And he said he was calling as a courtesy to sit down with me, to introduce himself, to tell me why he's running, why he's able to win, and what he's done for the Democratic Party. I did not call him back. Simply because I wanted to kind of avoid an uncomfortable conversation where I assumed he wanted to ask me to support him. As you noted, I'm an elected DNC member, which means during a brokered convention on a second ballot, I will have a vote to decide our next nominee. And I identify as a progressive activist, and I hope that whoever our nominee is able to excite the grassroots and increase voter turnout and fight for a progressive platform.
So why wouldn't you want to talk to Michael Bloomberg?
I mean, if they reach out to me now, I'm happy to offer him the courtesy and sit down with him. At the time, honestly, because of what happened at CAP, because of the policies he supported, because of the way he kind of entered the race and is now essentially bankrolling his campaign and buying an election, I felt very uncomfortable. And, if he or a member of his team reached out to me now, I'm happy to kind of offer them that courtesy and sit down with them. But at the time, I didn't feel comfortable doing that.
Let's talk about what could happen in the future. This whole idea of a brokered convention, and then the role you would play, Yasmin Tayeb, as a member of the DNC. Explain what this would look like.
Sure. So as you may know, we passed reforms in the DNC that eliminated the vote of superdelegates on the first ballot. So at the time when we passed these reforms, and these were the most progressive reforms the DNC had passed, from my understanding, and the grassroots was incredibly excited. These were reforms that I advocated for and lobbied for all across the Commonwealth of Virginia, talking to Democrats and telling them why these reforms are needed. At the time, unfortunately, when they passed, we were incredibly ecstatic, thinking that now the process in 2020 will become more fair and impartial, and the grassroots would be more kind of excited about this and less inclined to attack the DNC and kind of leaders in the party. Unfortunately, because of how I do believe this nomination fight is going to move forward, I believe we're still going to have at least 4 to 5 candidates that are viable heading into the convention. I don't believe we'll have a single candidate that's able to receive a majority of delegates. So in order to avoid heading into a second ballot, we need to have at least one candidate that has at least, I believe the number is about 1990 delegates. And I don't think that's going to happen. And this is particularly important and why candidates like Mayor Bloomberg are, doing their homework. I mean, the fact that he reached out to me, this is in the very initial part, the first couple weeks that he entered the race, shows that he knows it will likely be a brokered convention. And he's probably been reaching out to DNC members, trying to ensure that he has as many supporters on the DNC
Blake
as
Zeff,
possible.
this issue of superdelegates weighing in on the second vote, what do you foresee here and the significance of this?
Sure. So
let me put that question to Blake.
I was going to say, I think this really speaks to another key point about Bloomberg that's worth getting into, because if it was just that he had billions of dollars and a ton of money, Tom Steyer has a lot of money. Howard Schultz had a lot of money, right? That alone is not really the entire story here. For me, it's the story about Bloomberg and what makes his candidacy potentially very potent is that it's a combination of endless resources, but also an extremely smart team that he has. They're very canny and clever, and also what I would call their Machiavellian approach to winning. And the fact that they're calling all these members to try to see if they can get that support this early on really speaks to that. They are going to understand. Look, Mike Bloomberg made his fortune. He didn't inherit a fortune from like an oil family, right? It was from data, analytics, communications, media. He really understands these areas. And they are looking at the numbers, and they know what they need to do, and they are starting that this far out. That doesn't surprise me at all.
Very quickly, Blake Zeff, the role of President Obama. He is in so many of these national ads that are blanketing the networks across the country for Bloomberg, though he doesn't, specifically endorse him. Clearly, it seems like Bloomberg must have said, can I use you talking about me in these ads? What do you think Obama's role is here?
I'm not so sure that they got permission. Look, very quickly, the history between Bloomberg and Obama is not that they're some great friends at all. As everyone knows, Bloomberg was a Republican for a long time, endorsed George W. Bush in 2004 when Obama was giving his classic speech for John Kerry that year for the Democrats. Then in 2008, Bloomberg does not endorse Obama. In 2012, he endorses Obama at the very last second in an op-ed, almost half-heartedly, in which he criticizes Obama as being divisive and partisan and overly populist. So they work together on some issues like gun safety reform, the environment, things like that. And I'm sure that Obama, like others that we've talked about, is appreciative of the fact that Michael Bloomberg gave a lot of money for Democratic causes. But they were not best buds who have worked together on a lot of things. So the ad gives a little bit of a misleading impression, and I'm not so sure that Obama is secretly behind the scenes pulling for Bloomberg and gave him permission to do that. Finally, I wanted to go to a clip of seeing Michael Bloomberg at the UN Climate Summit in Madrid. We caught up with him after, what we thought he was holding a news conference at the U.S. Climate Action Center, which he funds, where journalists would go to ask politicians questions. He even shocked the people who worked at this We're Still In conference room when he, after speaking, wrapping up his comments, after he called all the press, and there are pictures of, him standing at the UN Climate Summit sign, he was surrounded by his officials and security and walked out. So I tried to follow him to get my question to him. Mayor Bloomberg, will you be taking questions from the press? If you could just answer a question. We all packed in there to ask you questions. But the UN has said that economic and climate inequality is driving protests around the world. Thank you, sir. You're a billionaire running for president. You've spent tens of millions more dollars than the other presidential candidates. Will that be your strategy to win the presidency?
We're here to talk about climate this week.
That was his campaign manager saying, we're going to talk, we're only talking about climate. Of course, that night he had a long interview with Christiane Amanpour, and he was talking all about the election. But calling a news conference and then walking out before the journalists got to ask the question, but having that photo op of hundreds of journalists around him. Blake Zeff, your last 20 seconds.
Look, that's just another example of their strategy, which is to try to control every aspect of the campaign they can. And that's what the commercials enable him to do. If you run so many commercials, and that's how you get your message out, you don't have to submit to interviews. You don't have to submit to scrutiny because you're already getting all the media coverage that you want. And that's a perfect example of their desire to really control every single aspect of this. And the money enables them in large part to do that.
Blake Zeff, I want to thank you for being with us, journalist and documentary filmmaker, and Yasmin Tayeb, a civil rights lawyer, elected member of the Democratic National Committee. When we come back, we talk about Yemen, where 31 people were killed in U.S.-backed Saudi UAE airstrikes this weekend, including women and children. The UN called it shocking. Stay with us. harps and dreams. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we look now at Yemen, where 31 people were killed in U.S.-backed Saudi UAE airstrikes over the weekend, including women and children. The strikes in the northern Al Jawf province came just hours after the Houthis said they'd shot down a Saudi fighter jet in the same area. The United Nations called the drone strike shocking. This is an unidentified Yemeni man speaking to reporters after the strike.
So we are here. This is one of the cars that were targeted by the Saudi American Air Force last night. And they also targeted villages in Malaha area and residential areas, causing tens of martyrs and injuries. And this is a civilian's car.
The deadly strike follows a recent uptick in violence in northern Yemen, comes as the war there hits a 5-year mark. More than 100,000 have died. Far more have been displaced since the conflict began in 2015. On Sunday, the United Nations said the Houthis and U.S.-backed Saudi and UAE coalition had agreed to a major prisoner swap, the first of its kind in the long-running war. For more, we go to Lansing, Michigan, where we're joined by Shireen Al-Adimi, Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University. Professor Al-Adimi, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about exactly what happened this weekend?
Well, this weekend, Amy, was one of another airstrike, unfortunately, that was targeting civilians in Yemen. This happened, as you mentioned earlier, right after the Houthis had downed a Saudi jet, which is very uncommon in Yemen, given that they don't have as many capabilities as the Saudi-led coalition does. But there were reports say that there were some children gathered around that area, around the wreckage, and then there was a strike that targeted those children and some neighboring houses. And so it's not unusual for the Saudi-led coalition to strike civilians. We just haven't heard about, a massacre, really, of 31 individuals in a while, although it's certainly been common over the last 5 years.
And can you talk about the U.S. role in what's going on right now and how dire the situation? I mean, I think the UN has called it the most dire situation in the world. The situation is now in Yemen.
There is no crisis on earth that's worse than Yemen, according to the UN. Over 80% of the population is, barely able to survive. Many people have already been facing famine and have died of starvation. And diseases like cholera and dengue fever are rampant in Yemen, because not just because of the airstrikes, of course, that have disabled the Yemeni healthcare system and other systems, but also the blockade that the Saudis and the UAE is enforcing. The United States has been a partner to the Saudis ever since President Obama's administration, and they've not relented. They've continued to support them through hundreds of billions of dollars in weapon sales, but also targeting assistance. And, up until November of 2018, they were providing mid-air refueling. They're still providing intelligence and updating and, vehicles and aircraft and training pilots. And so the U.S. is involved every step of the way. We know that this is unconstitutional. Congress has passed a resolution saying that this is unconstitutional, yet President Trump's administration continues to provide extensive support to the Saudis and Emiratis, without which this war will just not be able to continue to the same scale.
And can you talk about what's happening in the U.S. Congress, given that the U.S. is supporting through weapons the Saudi, who the Trump administration has a very close alliance with the Saudi regime? Can you talk about what's happening in Congress, what's passed, what hasn't?
Well, it took a number of years to do this. There was a lot of resistance before, but under the leadership of Senator Sanders in the Senate and Rouhani in the House, they were able to pass the War Powers Resolution, which is, invokes the War Powers Act of 1973 that authorizes Congress and not the president to go to war. And so they've declared that this is an unconstitutional war. It violates our own laws here. Of course, it causes massive casualties in Yemen, the worst that we've seen in recent history. But more importantly, according to Congress, they have been trying to stop this through legislation. And unfortunately, President Trump has vetoed this bill. And so, there are constant roadblocks. Most recently, they tried to amend the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020 to include certain provisions that would prevent the U.S. from providing targeting assistance and allocating any kind of budget toward helping the Saudis and Emiratis in their war in Yemen. And unfortunately, that was dropped at the last minute as well. There have been efforts, but it's been very difficult to try to get attention, to try to get sustained effort in this regard. And the reality is that every single day Yemenis are dying, and they're dying in massive numbers. The numbers that we know now are horrifying, but they don't even speak to the full extent of the losses that we're seeing in Yemen.
Late last month, 2020 Democratic presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders, along with Utah's Republican Senator Mike Lee and Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, reintroduced that resolution to end U.S. military support for the Saudi-led attacks on Yemen. This is Sanders speaking at a news conference.
According to the United Nations, the war in Yemen could lead to the most severe famine in more than 100 years, with some 100 million people at risk of starvation in one of the poorest countries on earth as a result of this war. According to the aid organization Save the Children, some 85,000 children in Yemen have already died of starvation, and millions more face death if this horrible war continues.
So what has come of this, Shireen Al-Adimi?
There's just been so much resistance. Once Trump vetoed the bill, we needed, 2/3 majority to overturn the veto, which we've not been able to achieve. There has been Republican support and almost, a full unanimous Democratic support now, but it's going to take a lot more. And at this point, supporting candidates like Bernie Sanders, who have been committed to ending this war, is really important. Millions and millions and millions of Yemeni lives are at stake here. And so it's really important to continue to come at this from various angles, because, the war can't stop because of the veto, but it has made things very, very difficult. But the War Powers Act is one of those acts that can be invoked over and over by any member of Congress. And so we have that to continue to pursue this.
Now, the relationship between the Trump family and Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Yemen, is the leader of Saudi Arabia, is very well known at the heart of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Can you talk about how that affects what the U.S. does? Jared Kushner with others and Wall Street leaders were at the so-called Davos in the desert in Saudi Arabia, meeting with Mohammed bin Salman. And this is after all the information come out, of course, around the dismemberment, the murder of the Washington Post columnist Khashoggi. The Guardian wrote a piece saying that House Democrats detailed how top Trump administration officials, including Michael Flynn and Jared Kushner, pushed to provide the Saudi government with technology to build nuclear power plants. That could put Saudi Arabia on the path to developing nuclear weapons and further destabilize the Middle East. Is this a concern of yours?
Absolutely, and I think it should be a concern for everyone. The Saudi regime has shown to be completely impulsive, and Mohammed bin Salman in particular has, driven an entire country to the brink of starvation. He is killing and starving Yemenis in the millions, and we continue to support him. He prosecutes and persecutes members of his own country who show any kind of dissidence to him, and we continue to support him. And so I don't think that this is a man who needs to be, having access to more technology that would cause even more death and destruction. The Trump administration has been very clear about why they support Mohammed bin Salman. A number of times Trump has said that the Saudis pay in cash. And so we've elected a businessman to the White House, and he's operating in a very businessman-like strategy where he is mostly concerned about how much money this is going to make the United States at the expense of not only, of course, international law and morality and humanitarian considerations, but also our own legal code and our own constitution. So nothing will get in the way of making money through the Saudis. And Mohammed bin Salman has been a very happy participant, with the Trump administration in power.
Shireen Al-Adimi, I want to thank you for being with us. Yemeni scholar, activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University, speaking to us from Lansing. Democracy Now! Is now currently accepting applications for a development manager position, as well as our news production fellowship, both here in New York City. To get more information and to apply, go to DemocracyNow.org. Very happy birthday to Neil Shibata and to Brendan Allen. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.